Is the Philippines a third world country? That's the question that we're going to be addressing in this video. And the short answer is no, it is not a third world country. I'm going to talk very briefly about why I'm making this video, why it's come up. Second, I'm going to talk about what the third world system is and answering the question why the Philippines is not a third world country. So stay tuned and you'll get the answer in this video. The reason I'm making this video is I keep getting over and over in the comment sections in my videos about the Philippines being a third world country, usually in a very derogatory sense that people don't want to come here because, oh, it's a third world country, I'd prefer to stay in mine. And they really show their ignorance when they're saying this. So that's why I'm making this video, so I can forever dispel the myth of the Philippines being a third world country. The world's first, second, and third worlds was originally a political division that was made up by a French economist back in the early 1950s. Now, this was in response to the Cold War, to where you basically had the United States and NATO on one side after World War II, and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, as well as their respective allies, on another. And then in the middle were all of the countries that were non-military aligned with those two great blocs during the Cold War. The First World was defined by the United States, NATO, and anyone who was in a military alliance with those two entities. The United States obviously being a member of NATO. So that included lots of different countries that sometimes are thought of, for whatever reason, as the third world today. So one of those countries was indeed the Philippines. Another was Thailand, another was Japan, and many others, as you can see from the maps that I'm listing here. So anyone who was in a military alliance with the United States or with NATO was considered a first world country. It didn't have anything to do with economics. It didn't have anything to do with poverty. It didn't have to do with how much industrial development a country it had. It simply was a political division of, were you in a military alliance with either the United States or with NATO as a whole. The Second World was the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and anyone who was in a military alliance or who was aligned with those countries. So obviously you had the Soviet Union, you also had East Germany, much of Central Europe, and some other countries such as China and Vietnam. Really in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was a division of communism and their allies, even though later on some of those countries such as China and Vietnam or China and Russia stopped being very friendly with each other. It was still all considered the Second World. Folks, if you like this content, make sure that you hit subscribe so that you can find me again in the future, and also hit the like button if you want to tell others that this is a video that's worth watching. Really helps in the YouTube algorithm to get it out there and let folks know that this is stuff that is worth watching, and it helps my channel grow, and I appreciate you for doing both. The Third World was any country that was left over that was not in an alliance with the United States or NATO or with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And so, although most of the countries were in Southeast Asia, in Africa, predominantly in Africa, and in Latin America, it didn't necessarily have anything to do with economic status. In fact, it didn't have anything. It was just, were you in an alliance with one of these people or not? So you've got some anomalies in there. For instance, with Ireland. Ireland was a very developed country. It has a good standard of living. It's usually most people would think of as a first world country who are ignorant of the reason that we have these three divisions. In point of fact, under that definition, Ireland, Finland, and other countries that were not aligned would have been the third world because they were not politically aligned between one of these two great blocs during the Cold War. Now, we'll move into how the perception of this changed at the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. After the Cold War, when the Soviet Union had finally collapsed, the Berlin Wall had come down, communism was basically extinct in all but maybe 6 countries throughout the world. The first, second, and third world really didn't have the meaning that it once had. It was no longer useful as a political tool to determine what side of the blocks you were on because really only one of those blocks survived. And then everybody else who was not in a military alliance with the first world. And it became to mean because many of those countries had been in Africa, had been in Latin America, and were considered developing countries, many of those countries actually weren't poor. We had mentioned about Ireland and Finland and some of the others, Yugoslavia, which broke off, Brazil. These places were not necessarily what you would think of as third world or poor countries or developing countries. They were countries that had large economies and were fairly strong. But because many of those countries had been in Africa, had been in Latin America, had been underdeveloped, then a lot of people got it in their minds who weren't educated that these countries were third world, and third world translated to not industrialized, translated in their minds to being poor. Had nothing to do with that. That's just the way that certain people associated with that, with the third, second, and first world, because they didn't understand and weren't educated in how it was really supposed to, the meaning was supposed to be derived from. So as these meanings became twisted, we start seeing people who are not educated in these facts and who are ignorant as to what the meanings are, start using them in a derogatory manner. And that's what we started seeing in the comments in the videos here about the Philippines. And I had in real life friends, family members who would describe certain countries that I was going to as third world countries. And it made me chuckle inside every time, and later makes me want to beat my head against the wall because it is so ignorant as to what the term actually means. And it doesn't mean poor. It doesn't mean that. It means exactly what we had explained here earlier in the video. So when I see that in the comment section of somebody doing that, trying to make a point, and they feel that they've really done something and they're really smart and they've made that point, all they've done in my mind is shown how ignorant they are and that they really don't know what they're talking about. And anyone in here who's going to say, no, the meaning of the word has changed, it's evolved, we have a vernacular in English. Yeah, we do have vernacular in English, but the meaning hasn't changed. And if you go to the dictionary to where people are trying to show where first world has had some updates to it, all you have to do to know that the term really hasn't changed officially in any capacity, especially in academics, is go to the definition for second world. And lo and behold, the definition for second world is unchanged since the 1950s. It stayed exactly the same because they don't know how to categorize that. So it's still a political term. It's being used by people that don't know what they're talking about to describe it as third world, but it's really inaccurate. So one way to describe some of these countries and to be accurate and non-derogatory would be to describe them as developing countries, or countries that are not yet industrialized or have a beginning of industrialization in their countries, or that just have a lot of poverty compared to nations that have a very robust economy, very highly industrialized, or even post-industrialization to where they've become and morphed into a service economy and making even more money. And you even see ignorance about this in academia. So when I occasionally will see, usually from some silly major that's trying to make some sort of a point, that they'll start throwing around the term third world. And I saw an entire presentation, and it had a good heart. It was dealing with women around the world and discrimination against women and feminism and everything else. And they showed this map. And this map has to be the most racist, ignorant thing that I have ever seen in my entire life. It basically has in green all of the third world countries, and then in yellow, countries that are usually considered third world. And if you will notice, other than Europe, Canada and the United States, Australia and New Zealand, in other words, every place else in the world that doesn't have predominantly white people must be the third world. Now, I'm sure that the author of this presentation wasn't thinking about that when they did it, but boy, does this make them look really dumb, and the subliminal message that's coming out of it and the just outright racism wants me to bang my head against a wall, because this stuff shouldn't be put out there in academics. God help what we're teaching our children in colleges nowadays. Back to the Philippines. The Philippines is a first world country. It always has been, because it has, since basically it was a country in 1946 when it got its independence from the United States, it has been consistently in a military alliance and under the protection in many cases of the United States. And that, by definition, from our French economists back in 1952, is what a first world country is. It has nothing to do with the economy of the Philippines. Now, the Philippines is a developing country, and you can see by some of the stuff that I have put up when I went to BGC and some of these other places that in many parts, you know, the economy, the Philippines is changing. It's becoming much more modern in certain areas. There's infrastructure developments that are going on right now here in Mindanao, where I'm currently at. We have a massive project where they're going to be building a train that is going to transit from Tagum all the way down to General Santos, which is really going to improve the infrastructure here in Mindanao, which has really been a place that's really been neglected in many cases in the Philippines compared to other places. So the Philippines is not a third world country. It's a first world country. It is a developing country, and it's got a lot of promise for the future. So now that you know what the truth is, the next time that you see somebody saying that in a comment section or in real life, you can, in a very nice way, educate them as to the fact that they don't know what they're talking about.